Acclaimed singer-songwriter David Gray in session, especially for BBC One, in an hour. But first, a Prime Minister under intense scrutiny as war looms in the Blair years.
This is the story of a man with a mission.
I don't believe that what is happening in Iraq today is anything other than an absolutely visceral, profound struggle between what is right and what is wrong.
It's the story of a friendship.
I view our relationship as a relationship forged in battle.
The story of the most controversial war of modern times.
You secretly agreed that you would support an invasion of Iraq. Is that true?
It is complete rubbish.
It became obvious that the Bush people had decided they just wanted to go, and they didn't care whether the weapons were there or not.
The story of how the British people came to question the very integrity of their Prime Minister.
Were you lying?
No.
Over the past few months, Tony Blair has given a series of in-depth interviews to Times columnist David Aronovich, describing as never before his years in power. For the first time, we are able to tell the full, inside story of the Blair decade. This week, how Blair invaded Iraq.
I think this is the most fundamental struggle of our time, and there is only one place to be, which is in the thick of it, and trying to sort it out.
Tony Blair sent British troops into action more times than any Prime Minister since Churchill. Before Iraq, there was Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan.
Here's a fella who's willing to stand for what he believes. In the face of criticisms or political consequence, he was willing to say, this is what I believe, and I'm going to stand strong. And I admire those kind of characteristics in people.
Blair believed he could change the world for the better and was prepared to use the British military to do it. But his moral certainty led to actions which cost him his popularity.
I hope in my heart that one day the Prime Minister may be able to say sorry.
He feels, I think, evil triumphs when good men do nothing. He does really believe that if something ghastly is happening, we have a duty to try and stop it.
Tony Blair's first major foreign crisis erupted when he had been in power less than 2 years. The Serbian province of Kosovo was sliding towards civil war, and Blair feared a repeat of the atrocities unleashed by Serb leader Slobodan Milosevic in Bosnia.
In the early 90s in Bosnia, we decided not to intervene. 750,000 deaths later, we realized that we had to.
The Conservatives had kept Britain out of the Balkans. Blair changed this. But when NATO launched a bombing campaign against the Serbs, Milosevic responded by expelling a large part of Kosovo's ethnic Albanian population. Blair believed that only the threat of an American invasion would stop Milosevic. But his close ally, President Clinton, was reluctant to commit American troops to such a remote conflict.
For Clinton to take the step of actually saying, okay, I'm going to insist that Milosevic backs down no matter what it takes, was a huge thing for him to have to do.
As the ethnic cleansing continued, some American papers turned on Clinton. The president thought the British were spinning against him, and during a transatlantic phone call in mid-May, he confronted Blair. Blair's senior foreign policy advisor was listening in.
There was a rant, really, from Clinton, and you could sense that Tony Blair was holding the phone a little bit away from his ear, and when he could get a word in edgeways, he would calmly, rationally explain what he thought would have happened. There was an angry Clinton and a calm Blair.
Slowly, argument by argument, Blair managed to win Clinton round.
And it was only really when Clinton, to his credit, actually signaled that the Americans may be prepared to put boots on the ground that Milosevic folded and the thing was over.
The Serbs withdrew without a fight. This was widely seen as Blair's victory, and it made him a hero with the Kosovan people.
For Kosovans, Tony Blair is a living hero. A few months ago, I visited a primary school in Kosovo, and while I was shaking hands with the pupils, one of them told me his name was Tony. I said, "Why?" And he told me it was because of the huge respect his father had for Tony Blair.
For Tony Blair.
I think it was a courageous position. From the perspective of what was right, what was wrong, I think the British position was the right one. To move forward and to end this outburst of terrible violence, of mass rape, mass killings in the Balkans.
For Blair, a clear sense of right and wrong would now become the guiding principle of his foreign policy. In Chicago in April 1999, he outlined what became known as the Blair Doctrine.
We have learnt twice before in this century that appeasement does not work. If we let an evil dictator range unchallenged, we will have to spill infinitely more blood and more treasure to stop him later.
My view, as outlined in that Chicago speech, was that we should regard ourselves in political terms living in an international community, that if there was a problem in one part of the world, it would affect the other part, and that we should regard ourselves as under an obligation to intervene and to help. To me, this is an aspect of the modern world in exactly the same way that it matters to us economically, so it should matter to us politically what happens in different parts of the world.
But the conflict in Kosovo had taught Blair a second, equally important lesson.
I believed then, and I've come to believe this even more strongly in relationship to other conflicts, that if the international community is united and presents a united front, and eventually we did in Kosovo, then it becomes a lot easier to resolve these issues with the minimum of bloodshed.
If Europe and America stuck together, they wouldn't need to fight. That was the lesson Blair drew from Kosovo. Just a year later, Blair again faced a foreign crisis, this one even more remote. The elected government of Sierra Leone was under threat from brutal rebel factions. When British troops were sent to evacuate British citizens, a group of them were taken hostage.
And it was a possibility, I'm not exaggerating, that hostages would be tortured, skinned, eaten. I remember saying to him, but you know, we have actually got the SAS, we could do something. He said, "Is it very dangerous?" And I said, "Yes, extraordinarily dangerous." "Are you going to get some people killed?" I said, "Almost certainly. But if you don't do it, something worse could happen."
I can remember just this look on his face, and he was just sitting at the desk in the corner, and he was kind of looking out, and I kind of felt what he was thinking. In the end, he is the guy who has to sit and sign a piece of paper that says people he's never met, people he doesn't know, never met their fathers or their mothers or their brothers or their sisters. He's sending them off possibly to get killed. And that, I think that does take you to a position that very, very, very few people ever go to.
Blair authorized a rescue mission. It was a success. The rebel movement was quickly defeated and collapsed. Unlike Kosovo, in Sierra Leone, Blair had deployed troops straight away, and it had worked. His belief in moral intervention was now allied with a confidence in his own judgment.
shit to him.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack.
The moment I saw what was unfolding and realized the scale of it and realized the likely cause of it, I did feel a really deep sense of mission. You know, I took a view then that the interventionism that I had promulgated as a policy around the time of Kosovo was going to have to be extended and used, but probably in very different circumstances and in circumstances that were going to be, you know, profoundly disturbing for people.
Blair felt his hour had come. Before 9/11, Blair's Chicago doctrine was little more than good intentions. To intervene effectively around the world would need American power. Now the vision was shared.
The thing I liked about Tony Blair was is that he could project, he could see. Tony Blair clearly saw the threats facing civilization after September the 11th.
Before 9/11, Bush had been even more reluctant than Clinton to commit American forces abroad. After 9/11, Bush became as keen as Blair to reshape the world around them. The two men quickly formed a genuine bond.
To me, it's easier to deal with a person who just believes in some basic fundamentals. And we didn't have long religious discussions. I mean, you know, what do you think of certain passages in the Bible? But I think it's more of kind of a psychology and a mood. It's just a general trust. I don't know if Tony Blair would ever say George Bush is my great personal friend. You know, he may. But I can tell you that my relationship was one that was comfortable. We laughed a lot. He kindly laughed at my corny jokes, and I laughed at his not corny jokes. I view our relationship as a relationship forged in battle, a relationship that was writing the first chapter of this ideological struggle against cold-blooded murderers who kill the innocent to achieve political objectives.
Is that how you see it too?
Yes, I do see it like that. I mean, I think this is partly about the modern world and Islam's place in it, but it's also partly about whether people are able to create, you know, disputes in which people end up hating each other rather than reconciling. And it is a struggle for a generation. I don't have any doubt about that at all.
So honored the British Prime Minister has crossed an ocean to show his unity with America. Thank you for coming, friend.
The kaleidoscope has been shaken. The pieces are in flux. Soon they will settle again. Before they do, let us reorder this world around us.
Osama bin Laden was quickly identified as the man responsible for 9/11.
فإن جهاد الأمريكان وإن قتال الأمريكان هو من صميم الإيمان.
The attack on the World Trade Center was the culmination of a series of attacks, including the bombing of the US Embassy in Nairobi in 1998, in which 214 people died. Bin Laden was operating from Afghanistan, and going after him meant going after Afghanistan's fundamentalist Taliban regime. Blair now embarked on a whistle-stop tour of the world's capitals, seeking to build an international coalition of the type that had defeated Slobodan Milosevic. It was a job for which he was particularly suited.
One of his great strengths is his power of persuasion, both at the level of charm. He had, oozes charm. He could articulate arguments better than any other world leader on the international stage.
Stephen Wall was the man who handled Blair's relations with Europe.
Of all the politicians that I worked for, he more than anyone had supreme confidence in the rightness of his own judgment, even more than Margaret Thatcher, I would say. So from the word go, he thought that he was right, and he thought that his powers of persuasion would prevail.
Blair was soon reaching out beyond traditional allies.
I remember going to see President Putin, and he was very supportive, because he had been saying for years, no matter how much you criticize me in Chechnya, please understand, this is an extremism that's going to erupt on you.
Blair's chief foreign policy advisor was present during the talks.
It was an extraordinary visit. They talked about how far would it be possible to include the new Russia in Western structures. And the thing that Putin wanted to talk about was a new relationship between the new Russia and NATO.
Blair was even talking to Iran.
I spoke to President Khatami of Iran. I remember doing that, I think, from the aeroplane, and just, saying this was something we had to be in together, and actually it was a perfectly good conversation, and Iran at that point was prepared to be part of this. I mean, I think there was the possibility then of constructing a very broad consensus of support.
Kabul fell on November the 13th. At that moment, Blair was at the height of his influence as an international statesman, as Britain's Foreign Secretary recalls.
In one sense, Tony was self-nominated, but there wasn't anybody else who got in his way. Tony was able to assume a leadership role, and he was mockingly called the deputy leader of the world, but there was a quite substantial truth in that.
But for Bush and Blair, Afghanistan was not the end of the war on terror. The Americans soon had their sights on a trio of rogue nations: North Korea, Iran, and Iraq.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
It quickly became clear Saddam Hussein was the next on the list. America's allies had been ready to take part in the operation against Afghanistan, but many could not see the logic of attacking Iraq. Now the international coalition Blair had put together came under serious strain.
We saw from the very beginning Iraq as a big mistake. Why now Iraq? The Kurds were well protected by a British and American Air Force. They lived under almost in the status of independence, and the massacres in the South took place years ago.
For the Americans, for President Bush, 9/11 changed the world, and the way the Americans view the world, and the way they related to the world. And I think that came as a bit of a shock.
Britain's man at the UN was also puzzled by the focus on Iraq.
I was very surprised by it then, because I didn't think it was that relevant to 2001, and I didn't think it was a proposal that could actually be followed through and done successfully. But that was my first impression, so I was quite shocked by it.
Over the winter of 2001, 2002, the focus in the war on terror somehow shifts to Iraq. Why did that happen?
Basically, I took the view after September the 11th that we had to alter completely our view about nuclear, chemical, biological weapons proliferation. That if we ever ended up in a situation where terrorists were able to gain access to these weapons, then they would use them. Because to me, the most important aspect of September the 11th, apart from the obvious human tragedy, was the fact that they killed 3,000 people, but if they'd been able to kill 30,000, that would have been better for them.
For Blair, Saddam was a danger who could no longer be ignored. Others felt the Americans were exploiting an opportunity.
The 11th of September changed the calculus of what was achievable in politics. That didn't mean to say that Iraq was connected to 2001. It just opened up possibilities where the American people would go with hard American action.
Some saw oil as a decisive factor.
It was about the idea that Saddam was weak. It was an oil-rich country in a perfect strategic position. If we overthrow this rotten dictatorship, this would be the perfect beginning of a chain of reactions in a positive direction.
There were 3 key meetings between Bush and Blair on the road to war in Iraq. The first occurred at the president's ranch a year before the invasion.
I'm going to put to you that at or around the time you went to visit President Bush at the Crawford Ranch in Texas, you secretly agreed that you would support an invasion of Iraq. Is that true?
It is complete rubbish that when I went to see President Bush at the ranch in Crawford in April 2002, that I said, right, okay, I'm up for it. What's more, he was not of that view at that time.
So what was discussed and decided at Crawford?
Only that the issue had to be confronted one way or another. But obviously, if it could be confronted differently and peacefully, that would be better. My view was always that if you built a strong enough international coalition, then it was possible to avoid military action. It was even possible, actually, to either to get rid of the regime or change its nature fundamentally, if the international community stayed together.
Blair was trying to repeat the Kosovo strategy, threaten war to avoid war. But some in the Bush administration saw little point in trying to build a coalition for Iraq. John Bolton was in charge of arms control.
It was clear, I think, from very early on, that France and Russia, at a minimum, had difficulty with the idea of using military force against Saddam Hussein for commercial reasons, for geopolitical reasons, for whatever reason.
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and Vice President Dick Cheney were particularly impatient with British diplomacy.
President Bush at least had an understanding of the difficulties that this decision was giving us politically, but you did have this sense that that Cheney and Rumsfeld were in somewhat of a different place, and really, whether Britain was there or not, well.
It was over Israel that tensions first emerged. For Blair, progress on the Arab-Israel dispute was vital if the international coalition in the war on terror was to hold together.
For me, the Middle East peace process was always absolutely fundamental to this, because you had to be able to show to the Arab and Muslim world that this was not just about us protecting us. If we wanted that broad coalition, we could not ignore the fact that for the Arab and Muslim world, this was absolutely in the soul of their being.
Many in Washington saw it differently.
Now, I'm not sympathetic to that point of view at all. If Israel disappeared from the map of the Middle East tomorrow, as some want to see happen, the conflicts within Islam and the radical Islamic patterns of behavior that we've seen over the last 10 years would continue unabated, because it's not Israel that really motivates them. It's the fundamentalist view they take of Islam as a religion and their hatred of the West and the United States in particular.
When world leaders met at the G8 in Canada in June 2002, disagreements were already growing over Israel. 2 days earlier, Bush had called on the Palestinians to remove their leader, Yasser Arafat.
I wouldn't exactly call myself the skunk at the picnic, but I think there was a fair amount of consternation at as a result of the speech I gave him, which in essence said that, we won't be dealing with Arafat.
That meeting in Canada was difficult. Everyone, including myself, was saying, look, George, he's their leader and you've got to work with it, and that's that. I remember there's quite a sharp exchange of views around the informal dinner conversation that we had on this issue.
It was clear the Middle East peace process was not a priority for the Bush administration. For Blair, it now became vital to succeed in the second part of the two-pronged strategy he'd developed to bind the international community together. He had to persuade Bush to take the Iraq issue to the UN. In July, he dispatched his senior foreign policy advisor to Washington.
Prime Minister made it absolutely clear in the message that I was instructed to deliver in the summer of 2002 that if the President chose to deal with this unilaterally, that was fine. What we're saying is if you do want us to be with you, we will have to go the UN route, and we would like the UN route to work.
Foreign Secretary Jack Straw was simultaneously delivering the same message to Colin Powell. The US Secretary of State was one of the few in the Bush administration who shared Blair's view of the importance of the UN.
Colin Powell and I formed an extremely close bond, and we're on the same page on issues. And we were working very actively indeed to try to secure a diplomatic solution. We were working extremely hard with the multilateral system to try to avoid military action.
But by now, all the talk in the media was of war. In August 2002, Bush and Blair spoke on the phone.
I remember a conversation when I was on holiday in France and spoke to him, and there was sort of fever pitch in the American media and indeed parts of the British media about imminent military action, and him actually saying to me, you know, they're all going to calm down. I mean, you know, we haven't figured this thing out yet.
It was time they did figure it out. A couple of weeks later, in early September, the two men met at Camp David for the second of their key meetings on the road to war.
The point about the September 2002 meeting was that it was really about the United Nations. Did we go down that route or not? And in the end, there was quite a discussion about it. And I mean, I certainly felt that it was resolved that we would go back to the UN.
I thought that Blair was responding to pressure from the left in the Labour Party. The idea of going back to the Security Council was a waste of time and potentially had with very negative implications if we couldn't get a clear resolution.
Despite the objections from his own team, Bush had agreed to take the UN route. But the President had also reached a vital understanding with Blair.
I think he was a little concerned as to whether or not I recognized how important it was to utilize the United Nations as a way to rally support, and I assured him that I wasn't, but I also assured him that sometimes you can get stuck in the United Nations to no end, and that at some point in time, if we get stuck, he and I, along with others, may have to say, well, enough's enough. Something has to happen. And he confirmed that he understood that was the case, and that gave me great, that helped me realize I wasn't going to the UN alone, for example, and wouldn't be the only guy saying, wait a minute, enough is enough. Thank you all.
Bush was in no doubt about the significance of the commitment he'd obtained from Blair.
Bush just sort of called me over and said, I'll say this, your guy's got cojones.
Which translates as?
Why don't you pull up your English-Spanish dictionary?
I thought it was a Spanish beer, but I subsequently discovered it meant balls.
It was now explicitly understood. If the UN route failed, Britain would stand by America, even if it meant war. Some of Blair's closest foreign policy advisors felt he had given away Britain's best bargaining chip too cheap, too early.
David Manning and others felt that the Prime Minister might have laid one part of the two-part message on too thick and the other part too thin. It had to be got across that we wanted Saddam dealt with and we would be with the Americans if force was used, and the Prime Minister was adamant about that, but they didn't want force to be used. And the second part of that came across to the Americans less strongly than the first part.
Blair didn't like to use leverage. He preferred to use persuasion. I think some of us felt that there might have been occasions when he could have used more leverage.
Even Colin Powell was frustrated that Blair did not take a tougher line with Bush.
Colin Powell said, in the end, Blair would never lie down on the railroad tracks. Jack Straw and I would get him all pumped up about an issue, and he'd be ready to say, look here, George. But as soon as he saw the president, he would lose all steam.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a view, which is that, I didn't really believe in this action, and therefore, at some point, I should have been prepared to say, look, I'm I'm not going to do this unless you do X, Y, and Z. I mean, it wasn't a bargaining chip for me. It was what I believed, and I still do believe it. It's, you see, the trouble is maybe, and I can't answer this, maybe some others didn't believe in it. I believed in it. You know, I wasn't in a position where I was negotiating with him in order to get him to do something different. In my view, if it wasn't clear that the whole nature of the way Saddam was dealing with this issue had changed, I was in favor of military action. I was going to be arguing for military action. I'm afraid it's in one sense, is kind of worse than people think, as far as my position is concerned. I believed in it. I believed in it then, I believe in it now.
We will work with the UN Security Council for the necessary resolutions. But the purposes of the United States should not be doubted. The Security Council resolutions will be enforced.
Bush had taken the Iraq issue to the UN, but many in Blair's team were now nervous that Blair's transatlantic balancing act carried huge risks, as Britain's man in Washington recalls.
My obsession sitting in Washington was that there was going to be a train smash at the end of it. And I remember sending a report saying, for God's sake, one of the things you've got to watch out for is exhausting the UN processes, or UN process, which we had in principle agreed with the Americans would actually mean something different to them from what it meant to us, leave alone the rest of the Security Council. And we would find ourselves in a situation at some juncture where the Security Council, the majority of the Security Council were over there, and the United States was there, and where the hell would we be?
Blair was facing a skeptical public at home. His case for war was based on Saddam's possession of weapons of mass destruction. In September, he presented an intelligence dossier to Parliament.
His weapons of mass destruction program is active, detailed, and growing. The policy of containment is not...
The weapons of mass destruction program is not shut down, it is up and running now. Were you lying?
No, look, the intelligence of every sort of country in the world was more or less the same, which was that Saddam had an active program. The fact is that Saddam had used chemical weapons against his own people. The inspectors, when they'd left those years back, had said that there was this massive amount unaccounted for. At no point were people saying, from any of the intelligence services, including our own, well, actually, you're barking up the wrong tree, it doesn't exist.
Lord Butler was later commissioned to investigate the government's use of intelligence. He believes Tony Blair overstated the firmness of the information given to him.
The precise quotation was that the picture presented by the intelligence was extensive, detailed, and authoritative. And no, I think this is the one instance where he really got close to misleading Parliament.
I think what's being said is that you expressed a certainty about the intelligence which actually you weren't quite entitled to.
Yes, but I think that is why it is actually important that people go and read the reports. Because it's true that there were debates in those reports about the extent of it. You can't be sure about how far it's growing and so on. Is it growing fast? Is it growing at a slower pace and so on? But I mean, as I say, I just simply defy people to go back and read them and say, well, actually, you conclude from that he didn't have such a program. Or it was an issue whether he had such a program.
I don't think that most other prime ministers I worked for would have published a dossier. I think they wouldn't have been quite so desperate to persuade the world by that means, to say, you may not believe me, but you will believe what the intelligence community says. That, I think, was something that was particularly part of Tony Blair's style.
Blair now wishes he'd presented the raw intelligence given to him by the Joint Intelligence Committee, or JIC.
In retrospect, what we should have done is just publish the JIC reports. I mean, if we'd done that, we would have had no controversy at all, because those are the reports that I'm was receiving. And what I always say to people when they write to me or talk to me about this is say, well, look, they're on the website now, you know, go and read them. And then tell me that you would have concluded from that there wasn't a problem.
Briefly, in the autumn of 2002, it did look as if Blair might succeed in holding the international community together. On November the 8th, the UN Security Council unanimously passed Resolution 1441, calling on Saddam to disarm.
The regime in Baghdad now faces an unequivocal choice between complete disarmament and the serious consequences indicated in operative paragraph 13.
But the precise implications of the resolution were unclear.
The price of unanimity was ambiguity, and the ambiguity was about the trigger for war. Now, the Americans interpreted that resolution as giving them authority to go to war if need be. A whole bunch of other guys out there, including the French, the Germans, who were on the Security Council at the time, if I remember rightly, the Russians and Chinese didn't believe that. No automatic trigger was what our European allies said. And they meant it.
By the end of November, Saddam had bowed to American pressure and allowed inspectors back into Iraq. But as they searched over the following months, they failed to find any of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction.
In the autumn of 2002, I was of the same view as practically everybody else, that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction because of the way they had behaved towards the inspectors in the 1990s. Now, gradually, when we began to inspect, evidence undermined the gut feeling.
Blix requested help from Western intelligence services.
So we asked them, you are convinced that there are weapons of mass destruction. Tell us which are the sites you believe there are. And we got perhaps 100 sites given by UK and US and others. And we had time to go to about 3 dozen of them. And in no case did we find any weapons of mass destruction. And I asked myself then, now, if this were the best cases they had, and they said it was the best, then what is the rest?
In January, President Chirac told Blix he didn't believe there were WMD in Iraq.
He said that he didn't think there were any weapons of mass destruction. We then said to him that, look, your own intelligence services think so. And he then countered and said, you know, these guys intoxicate each other. Well, it was very true.
In meetings with the British, Chirac made little attempt to hide his disdain for the American president.
I can't remember President Chirac's exact words, but the sense of them was that he had contempt really for George W. Bush and therefore didn't buy into any part of George W. Bush's agenda. He felt that George W. Bush was somebody who'd kind of come from nowhere, knew very little about the world, had very little experience, very little wisdom, and therefore was reaching pretty radical conclusions about the state of the world on very little knowledge.
By the new year, a Franco-Russian-German bloc, firmly opposed to the war in Iraq, was starting to solidify.
We didn't believe the reasons are sound to wage war. You will go into a fight with a revolutionary nationalism, which will maybe you bring together nationalism and the new religious-driven political Islam, Islamic fundamentalism, and terrorism.
It became more important for the French, Germans, and Russians to stop the superpower taking unilateral action than to deal with Saddam's defiance of the UN Security Council.
On January the 31st, 2003, Blair, still hopeful, went to Washington for the third of his key pre-war meetings with Bush. It was clear a second, less ambiguous UN resolution would be needed. But Bush had already penciled in March the 10th as the start date for military action, just 6 weeks away. By now, even Blair's ally, Colin Powell, was wearying of the UN route.
Colin Powell said, Blair's the one who wanted the second resolution, and he alone. No one else in the US government wanted it. I certainly didn't want it.
Yes, there was big resistance to that. I mean, there was a certain amount of resistance to the November resolution. There was big resistance to a second resolution. But, you know, I mean, rather contrary to what people sometimes say about this, I mean, I was very insistent with the president that we had to try for it. And in the end, he was prepared to try for it.
Yeah, but he did it to oblige you.
Yes, I think he did.
The troop build-up was now accelerating in the Gulf. The British embarked on a diplomatic offensive. They needed to prevent the French or the Russians exercising a veto, but they also needed a majority on the broader UN Security Council, whose membership rotated. Junior Foreign Office Minister Valerie Amos was dispatched to Africa.
I was actually asked by the Prime Minister to go and talk to the leaders of the 3 African countries that were on the Security Council at the time, Angola, Cameroon and Guinea.
But in Cameroon, she found herself having to wait for President Biya, who was in Paris talking to President Chirac.
I spent quite a lot of time watching the rain come down in a very, very green Cameroon.
Eventually, Amos saw all 3 African leaders, but the French were hot on her heels.
The French Foreign Minister at the time, Dominique de Villepin, made a journey immediately on the back of my visit to exactly the same countries to talk to those leaders.
Amos was forced to return to Africa to counter the French influence. British diplomacy was struggling.
I went down to talk to the presidents of Mexico and Chile on the instructions of Tony Blair, and it was quite clear they felt things were being rushed, and they also felt they were under terrific pressure in a very seriously divided Security Council. They didn't want to be made to choose.
Some in Blair's team felt American efforts for a second resolution were half-hearted.
London felt that if the Americans engaged and really tried to look for Security Council votes, then people would have to respond to American pressures. There was a lot at stake in all of this. And I certainly don't feel, looking back now, that the Americans ever really put their shoulders to the wheel on this, because they were saying to themselves, we've got to humour the Brits. We will go and do this anyway, whether the Brits are there or not.
I can remember him asking me to make phone calls, which I did, but it was all in an effort to help our friends and allies be in a better position to eventually accomplish a mission that we all had come to the conclusion that needed to be done.
On February the 15th, more than 1 million people marched through the streets of London in opposition to the war.
Well, the march was, even if people on these marches always kind of exaggerate the numbers, right? But there were a lot of people there. And usual rule of thumb, for everyone who's on it, there were probably 10 or 20 who thought about going. So none of us were in any doubt as to how unpopular the policy was. I can remember at one point saying to him, look, if at the end of this you are history before your time, is it really, 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 really worth it, Iraq? And he said, look, it's always worth doing what you think is the right thing.
I do not seek unpopularity as a badge of honor, but sometimes it is the price of leadership, and it is the cost of conviction.
Blair's resolve in the face of massive opposition did win him conservative support.
I think the decision over Iraq was the right one. It brought him deep unpopularity, but I saw a guy under massive pressure, but who, having made this decision, was not going to just run around courting public opinion. This is a Blair who was going to stay the course on this one, absolutely, regardless of who was up against him. And I found that in a peculiar sort of way rather admirable.
But in Iraq, there were still no signs of weapons of mass destruction. On February the 20th, Hans Blix picked up the phone to Tony Blair.
I said to him that we were not impressed with intelligence. And I also said explicitly to him that it would be paradoxical if you were to invade Iraq with 250,000 people and find very little.
I do recall the conversation, and one of the things that I have to say is that when I was talking to Hans Blix through this period, I was saying to him, look, you've got to take these people out of the country and interview them, the scientists and the engineers. He was very clear that it was difficult to do that because these people might be killed. And I said to him, well, that is an indication of what we're dealing with then. And he was also very clear that he he believed that in any event, it was important to avoid conflict. And I used to keep saying to him, look, that isn't, your job is just to tell us the facts.
As he wrestled with the dilemmas facing him, Blair confided in an old friend.
He was trying to be faithful to this transatlantic relationships, be faithful to the transcontinental relationships. He wanted to keep his European work together, and he wanted the NATO allies to stay together, all of us. It became obvious that the Bush people had decided they just wanted to go, and they didn't care whether the weapons were there or not, or they didn't care anything. They wanted to do this war.
The Kosovo strategy of a united international front was unraveling. Blair's gamble had failed. Even he couldn't bridge the transatlantic gulf this time.
To be absolutely frank about it, at that time, coming into February, early March 2003, I mean, truthfully, I was in a position which didn't really have a constituency anymore. The American system was, in my view, totally understandably wanting to move this thing forward. And I think for the countries on the other side, they decided, now we're going to draw the line in the sand here.
I do have some sympathy, but did Britain have to be in that position? Is the North Atlantic relationship so powerful, so existential, that it trumps all things? That's the question.
On March the 10th, President Chirac appeared on French television, stating his opposition to a second resolution.
France will vote no, because it considers tonight that there is no need for war to achieve what we all want, the disarmament of Iraq.
It was a fatal blow to Britain's hopes of a second resolution, but also an opportunity. Chirac's words were ambiguous, but he was now blamed for killing the UN process.
Very soon after, Alistair Campbell had gone out and spun what Chirac had said, I had a phone call from quite a prominent Labour backbencher, former government minister, fluent French speaker, who said to me, you do realise, don't you, that Chirac didn't actually say what you guys are saying he said? And I said, yeah, we do realise that.
We have had to conclude that Council consensus will not be possible in line with Resolution 1441. One country in particular has underlined its intention to veto any ultimatum, quote, no matter what the circumstances, unquote.
It wasn't a glorious moment. I didn't feel particularly proud of that statement as it was made that day.
Tony Blair's senior foreign policy advisor now regrets that more time was not given to the diplomatic process.
I felt that the end game was rushed. The situation by early March was, very polarized. It was very difficult to have a proper debate about what was going on. And I think if the inspections had been allowed to run into the summer, then perhaps you would have got a new dynamic among the key players. So I did regret that, yes.
Do you feel that the military necessities and timescale began to override what were still possibilities in the diplomatic timescale?
Well, I think this is the true position, that once you get into a situation where your troops are down there and where there's tremendous propulsion towards military action, it requires something fairly significant in order to shove that back and break it and delay it. I think if we got a second resolution, you would have opened up that whole possibility, but you were never realistically going to get that.
The American military timetable had reached 0 hour, and Blair faced a vote in Parliament. There was a real danger he could be forced from power. President Bush picked up the phone.
I said, rather than lose your government, be passive. You know, we'll go without you if need be, because I don't want you to lose your government.
He was always very cognizant of the difficulty I had. He was, as he used to say, determined that we shouldn't end up with the regime change being in Britain. He was saying to me, look, I understand this is very difficult, and, you know, America can do this militarily on its own, and if you want to stick out of it, stick out of it. And I was equally emphatic that we shouldn't do that.
There were plenty of people around you saying, look, Prime Minister, you don't have to do this. So why didn't you accept his offer?
Because I think it was important then, and it's important now, that we stick with America in this, that we don't have them try to do it on their own. I think this is the most fundamental struggle of our time, and there is only one place to be, which is in the thick of it, and trying to sort it out. And, you know, yeah, of course we can get out, we can be a medium-sized country that sort of hides itself away at the back and doesn't push itself forward and says to America, well, if you really think there's a problem, you go and sort it out. That's not what I want for my country. It's not what I believe the world should be like.
Saddam was defeated in just 3 weeks. But Blair's goal of an international community united to reshape the world following 9/11 was further away than ever. And it quickly became clear that the major justification for the war did not exist. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Do you think that there was a good argument for you to have resigned when WMD was not discovered?
I think if there'd been any case of us doctoring the evidence or interfering with them, that's why we established the Hutton inquiry, which after all was a 6-month inquiry in which, in front of a law lord, and I think it's the first time a Prime Minister, the heads of the security services and people have ever given as extensive evidence of that. And I believe very strongly that had I walked away in 2003, it would have been the wrong thing to have done, because I would then not have been in a position where I could continue to oversee what I believed and believe still was a major and fundamental struggle.
But did you think about it?
No, I didn't think about it, actually.
Soon, the situation on the ground in Iraq was spiraling out of control. Jeremy Greenstock was sent out as British envoy in September 2003 and found the American operation chaotic.
Hey, watch your goddamn fire!
It was dysfunctional. The civilian side wasn't talking to the military side. The different parts of the military command were not agreeing with each other. The intelligence and the civilian assessments were different. And there were divisions, of course, in Washington as well, between the State Department and the Pentagon.
Southern Iraq.
General Tim Cross had been sent across to liaise with the Office of Post-War Planning at the Pentagon 6 weeks before the invasion.
The major plan for post-war Iraq was that we do not need a plan, that Iraq would resolve itself in effect. And therefore one saw that in the context of the numbers of US military that were initially going to be deployed, and then the plan for reducing those numbers. If you took the view that you didn't need a detailed plan because it would all be okay, then fine. If you took the view that actually it would be more complicated than that and more difficult than that, then it didn't take long to reach a conclusion that we hadn't thought this through very well.
What people absolutely love to do is to say, well, it was because of a mistake in the planning. No one planned for the aftermath and all the rest of it. It's not really right. Actually, what has happened fundamentally is that the people that we're fighting have decided to fight back. And the nature of the struggle that's been going on since September the 11th, but actually before then as well, has now expressed itself in what is happening in Iraq.
4,000 American dead, 150 British dead, 75,000 Iraqi dead by the most conservative estimate, more than 3 million refugees. Have you had moments of doubt and anguish as you've seen that?
I think if you didn't have moments of doubt and anguish over what has happened, then there's something pretty profoundly wrong with you.
What about you?
Yeah, with me, if I didn't. Or an acute sense of responsibility, which I have, and I have every day and will have for the rest of my life, every day. But I can't say what I don't really believe about this. And what I believe in the end is that this is, whatever it began as, it is part of this wider struggle today. And if there's anything I regret about this period, it is I regret not having laid out for people in a clearer way what I saw as the profound nature of this struggle and the fact that it was going to go on for a generation.
It's a hard war. It's not only hard to remove a thug that was a murderer that had at least the knowledge to make weapons of mass destruction, but it's hard to replace a tyranny with a new democracy. But we came to the conclusion it was necessary work for future generations. We're willing to do the hard work now so that a part of the Middle East that has produced killers will change.
He saw, I think, from the beginning, when he became Prime Minister, that he needed a strong relationship with the United States. And being Blair, he really wanted to be the best friend of whoever it was. I think in the case of Iraq, he probably neglected to fulfill the role of asking all the searching questions of an American president, because he was actually on the side of egging them on.
It was a missed opportunity, a historical mistake. We will pay altogether, whether we were in favor or opposing the waging war in Iraq, we will pay a very high price for that, altogether.
I don't believe that what is happening in Iraq today is anything other than an absolutely visceral, profound struggle between what is right and what is wrong.
In Chicago, Tony Blair had outlined a vision of a better world in which powerful nations intervened to root out brutality and injustice. After 9/11, this vision became inextricably linked to the American War on Terror. And Blair's goal of an international community united for freedom and justice narrowed to an alliance with George W. Bush.
We've written the first chapter in what is a long ideological struggle. The forces of good and moderation and human rights and justice versus forces that are evil, that'll kill. I'm confident I will look back when I'm even older guy than I am today and say, what an amazing relationship I had.
I haven't changed since that Chicago speech. But the whole point about struggles of fundamental nature is that they're really, really difficult. The whole point about alliances is that they're not forged when things are easy.
Blair's fear now is that his successors lack his burning sense of moral certainty and determination to stay the course.
The enemy that we're fighting, I'm afraid, I think has learned that our stomach for this fight is limited. And I think they believe that they can wait us out. Our determination's got to match theirs, and our will's got to be stronger than theirs. And at the moment, I think, it's probably not.
Next week, in the final program in this series, the story of how Tony Blair was sustained by his faith in God as he made the long journey from public adulation to defiant isolation.
And that's next Sunday at 10:15 here on BBC One.